Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today, for joining us in the Zoom world. Um, very excited to be in community with you all and to be able to share space and like have a conversation about gender, share what we know, have you all share what you know in the Q&A section. Very excited to be in the space and to be able to converse, talk with everyone here. And thank you for being here on a 5 p.m. on a Thursday. It is very much appreciated. Pass it on to Favor.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. And this meeting is also recorded. So like if you have to leave early or someone else wanted to come, but they weren't free at this magical time, we'll send out a recording afterwards. But I'll start by really briefly going over like the structure of the event, and then I'll go through some event bios. We're gonna start with a lovely lecture by both Eva and currently Clone, but Maria. And then we'll have 3 panelists talk generally, then we'll have like an open Q&A, and then that'll be basically the end of it. So I will go into the bios. You first have Eva, and Eva L.J. Kim is a doctoral candidate in English at the University of Pennsylvania, and she received a BA in creative writing at Macalester College and currently serves as a coordinator of the Mellon Mays Fellowship Program at Bryn Mawr College. Her work can be found in the Journal American Studies and exhibition catalog About Face, Stonewall, Revolt, and New Queer Art. Maria Murphy is the Associate Director of the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies. Maria's research examines the relationship between music technologies and body politics through multimedia performance art. As part of her research practice, she has performed as her own clone, a submissive mask for Mass Daddy, and an abstract dandelion powered by fans, as well as a 19th century Irish immigrant sex worker. And then Sam Moore is a doctoral candidate in English and Media Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and their research focuses on TV shows about high school and youth politics. Malik Muhammad joins us as Associate Director of the University of Pennsylvania's LGBT Center. Malik has a bachelor's in psychology as well as a master's in higher education counseling and student affairs from Westchester University of Pennsylvania. And within his role at Penn, he diligently works to support students, faculty, staff, alumni, and community members. And he spearheads the center's educational outreach programs, advises many LGBTQ plus student groups, fosters collaboration across Penn, and also serves the Philadelphia community as a member of the Penn Center for AIDS Research Community Advisory Board, the Colors Organization Board, and a talented local artist entertainer. And last but not least is Justin. Justin Achampong is a current junior in the College of Arts and Sciences. They study psychology with a minor in sociology, and their sociological background has allowed them deeper considerations of gender, the family, sexuality, race, and how all 3 affect each other. And I'll briefly thank our co-sponsors, which is the SNF Padilla program, the Student Committee on Undergraduate Education, or STU, and the New Student Orientation and Academic Initiatives program, which is NSO. So I will hand it off to Maria now.
Good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to Understanding Gender, a special episode of Difficult Listening Hour, the spot on your dial for that relentless and impenetrable sound of difficult music. So sit bolt upright in your straight back chair, button that top button, and get set for some difficult music. Ooh la. Ooh la, ooh la, ooh la, ooh la, ooh la, I came home the other day and I opened the door with my bare hands. And I said, hey, who tore up all my wallpaper samples? Who ate all the grapes, the ones I was saving? And there was this guy sitting there and he had this smile. And when he smiled, he showed these big white teeth, like luxury hotels on the Florida coastline. And when he closed his mouth, it looked like a big scar. And I said to myself, holy smokes, looks like some kind of guest host relationship to me. So I said, hey, pal, what's going on here? Who are you? And he said, now, I'm the soul doctor. And you know, language is a virus from outer space. And hearing your name is better than seeing your face. Hey folks. I'm so sorry. Maria actually couldn't make it today. And so she asked me to fill in. I'm her clone. And I'm so sorry. Do you all mind if I smoke? Thanks so much. I get nervous in crowds. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so maybe I'll just introduce myself. I go by different names, Richard Tucker, Algorithm, Daddy, a few others, but you can just call me Clone. Yeah, and I know my appearance and a few other characteristics are still a little glitchy. Maybe my voice, which I do want to, at some point talk about, but I'm a clone, and cloning remains a newer phenomenon. But I do think there's something to say here about cloning in relation to gender, like thinking through the production of a reproduced subject, like me. Like gender is also, like cloning, intimately connected to the very precarious and unsettled conditions by which bodily sovereignty, reproductive labor, and personhood are defined and redefined politically, geographically, historically, geopolitically, in the social sphere, in the public imaginary, a whole bunch of places. And gender, I think we can agree, it's not really constituted in a vacuum. It participates and is co-constituted by a dense network of matters of concern spanning technology, bodies, kinship formations, labor division, labor distribution, and state institutions and policy. As I was thinking about my little opening vignette, language too, I think plays a central role in defining gender. At least language seems to repeatedly attach certain associations and signifiers to make gender adhere as some kind of concrete thing. But I think we can all see how language can misrepresent or miscommunicate the veracity of a statement presented as truth. Failing to harness that illocutionary force of a claim or declaration, or maybe really mismatching an action with an intended meaning. We're certainly seeing that now in the US and internationally within legal context, right? Where language is, a composing agent and the sonic network of neglectful and damaging silence, misinformation, and all forms of legalized violence. Language often attempts to account for and represent and misrepresent how we occupy our bodies, like how we put on our human suits. Anyway, Maria gave me some lecture notes, something about like the one sex model and the medicalization of sex, and then like the invention of gender as a separate category. But I'm not sure it's all that clear cut. Like her notes actually seem like pretty vague. So anyway, understanding gender is such a big concept that there is, of course, an entire scholarly field just dedicated to try and articulate what the hell gender is, or maybe even what gender does. Gender and sexuality studies is a field dedicated to uncovering, analyzing, and perhaps even dismantling the gendered social orders that govern so many of our social interactions and determine how we move around in the world. Think about it. How many times in any given day do people have to navigate a male, female binary system as a way to organize society, as a way of organizing bodies and moving bodies around in specific ways? There's lots of obvious examples to point to, like how public restrooms are often divided into men's and women's bathrooms. And then, you go to the airport, you're going to walk into that full body scanner, and the TSA agent has to look at you, and based on their interpretation or their perception of your gender, select male or female on their little computer screen to determine how your body is going to be read by some agent in another room. That person has really been deputized to do more, like way more than they are paid to do. It's also likely that your license has an M or an F to indicate sex, though of course those bureaucratic red tape problems are slowly changing. And I'm sure there's, lots of other examples that we can think of. So there's, some trends, some common ways that we talk about gender. Like, have you ever heard that line that sex is your biology, your anatomy, or even your plumbing, which is really weird, but that gender is how you identify, how you feel, what your sense of your own body is? I hear that a lot. And I mean, I think it can be a helpful mantra in that it shows how these concepts can be socially constructive, but I think it can also be a bit reductive. When we talk about gender identity, it always comes with identity in these examples, there are some common explanations, that gender identity is often your own individual sense of gender and how you may choose to express it. And that gender that you express or identify as may or may not correspond with the sex you were assigned or had imposed on you at birth. But again, I think that these kind of common explanations are they're a bit reductive. Many would argue that sex is also partially socially constructed, and anatomy and biological articulations of sex aren't as clear-cut as we sometimes think. Even medical writing and scientific literature can present and reify a constructivist portrayal of sex. And sometimes, in an effort to find the language to articulate embodiment and bodily expression, we try to simplify our understanding of these relationships. So again, the idea that sex is biological, gender is social or cultural, that sex is bodily anatomy and genitals, and that gender is historical, socially constructed, it's the culturally contingent category. But historically, there have been many, many ways that both scientific research within various historical, geographical, and political contexts have supported and substantiated this sex-gender dichotomy, which I think at the very least, we need to problematize, right? I mean, we need to trouble that dichotomy. Trying to locate the ostensible scientific truth and source of sex as biological has a particularly powerful social impact in the 20th century, for example. Whether it's medical and scientific researchers trying to locate the source of sex in physical anatomy, right? And then that didn't quite work out. So then they're like, okay, let's zero in on those chromosomes. And if scientists can't determine it at that level, perhaps at the level of hormones, I mean, it's a pursuit for something more exact that never quite pans out. Many scholars in gender and sexuality studies might argue that sex is already socially determined, or maybe even that gender as a category was itself created in various medical and scientific arenas. So, can the category of gender be can it be a medical invention? Because we thought gender was the social category, right? We thought it was related to identity, not something medical. So the supposed clear delineations between sex, gender, and even sexuality are not as clear as they may seem to us in our current moment. But from what I understand, there's a lot of exciting scholarly work, some of which we're about to hear from Eva, and tons of informal communities of knowledge that are showing that these categories of gender, sex, and sexuality share much more overlap. They're much more historically and socially contingent, and they're much more recent modes of understanding gender than maybe we previously thought. I think it's worth asking and thinking through in these discussions, who are the people and what are the institutions, that are considered the arbiters of gender? I mean, my own ontology, like my own sense of myself as a clone, as you can imagine, it's fairly personally confusing. Given that I was created in a lab and meant to be an exact replica of someone else, I'm not sure that my creators really reached their goals, maybe their normative goals that they had in mind. We often talk about non-normative gender politics, meaning all the folks who don't clearly subscribe to a distinct binary understanding of gender, but who determines what's normal. If you press on these definitions a little bit, you might see a theme of how medical and governmental institutions have long been the arbiters of determining normalcy. So even as we may refer to non-normative gender, I want us to consider the distribution of power in the self-determination of gender. Who is in control? What institutions determine what is normal embodiment and normal gender expression? I myself have always been interested in how voice can index these discussions, since my voice is mediated by many of the medical and technological issues I mentioned earlier. I wonder what can be rendered audible in the political arena through voice and body. To hear how voice and gender are always already potentially alien to the body from which it issues, conjugating a gendered listening that attempts to summon a particular body, but doesn't necessarily correlate to the voice one hears. Maybe today, hearing from me, a clone, has even initiated anxieties and discomfort in you, from hearing a voice that undeniably embodies and renders audible the indexical but fractious relationship between voice and body. Because after all, if there's anything to learn from me and my own embodiment as a clone, or I mean, there might be more than one thing, but one thing is that my voice's ostensible claim to a gendered truth is really a political fiction. Because I mean, honestly, what can we glean from a voice? How do we listen to voice? We hear pitch, timbre, tone, color, grain, and from this listening, we often imagine, assume, and construct particular bodies, unique political subjects from which a voice is produced. Before you've even understood what I'm saying, you've already heard my voice. My voice touches you and reaches you in a way my words cannot, and in a way that I cannot control. My voice is like the skin of my thoughts. Its cadence resonates along a signifying chain, sounding a record or archive of my own personal history, however imperfect or incomplete. These types of assumptions about the sound and source of voice lead us to one of its political fictions, that voice conveys immediacy, presence, truth. Having a voice and being heard seem like they go together, but in fact rarely do, not because we aren't heard, but because we rarely have a voice. Our voices are not projected, but are themselves projected onto. As my voice is projected in this space, I challenge you
to hear the fiction, the friction, and the production of my voice. Thank you.
Emoji reactions are also pretty good, but thank you so much, Clone, Maria, whomever you may embody today. And we're going to turn it over to the lovely Eva.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eva. Thank you, Clone, for that. That was amazing. Yeah, wow. Okay, I have a lot of thoughts about my voice now and am feeling weird about it. No, it's okay. I'm interested in it. I loved that whole ending. But okay, so my name is Eva Kim. I'm a PhD student in English. As Favor mentioned, I do have a presentation. This portion's a little more lecture-y, but we're going to hop around a lot and we're going to talk about, you know, all the trans bills going on and all sorts of different examples of trans people and how it relates to some of the concepts that Maria or Clone is talking about. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Give me one sec. Okay, can y'all see that? Yeah, great. Okay, let me full screen it. All right, there we go. Okay, so what I love about Clone's performance, but also just drag and performers in general, is that what they really show us, right, is that gender is mutable, it's plastic, it's flexible, but also that there's so much that's informing the way we read it, right? If we were actually in person and we were at a club and Clone pulled out a cigarette, it would read so different than it did here in a Zoom room. I might have way more tips ready for Clone, you know, and I could really demonstrate that. Or we could think about what city we're in, what other performers are on stage, how they got introduced. A friend of mine just did a whole drag performance based on a Euphoria episode and changed her makeup throughout, right? There are all of these different scripts that we get that inform the way that we consume a performance and engage with it. All of this, I think, for me, points to some of the basic concepts that drive gender studies and our ideas about gender in the first place. So if you've taken an intro gender course with either of us, you've probably seen this clip. I'm just going to show a minute and a half of it because I think something that's really helpful is to think about gender as performed versus gender as performative. So here's Judith Butler talking just for a little bit about that concept. Oh wait, I just realized I might need to share sound differently, right?
Yep. If you choose share screen and then share computer audio, it'll share that.
Okay, thanks. Do I need to hit a new share?
Yeah, you might have to stop and restart.
Oh, my bad. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, you're good. You're good. So is it under the?
Yep. So if you hit share screen, there's a little checkbox at the way bottom left that says share sound.
Oh, under share screen, not under video.
Right, yep.
Okay.
So do it
Got
like a
it.
normal share screen. You found it?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool, yeah.
Oh, I wonder if that's not gonna, all right.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying
Can y'all
gender
hear
is
that?
performative. When we say gender
Oh,
is
great. Okay,
performed,
good.
we usually mean that we've taken on a role. We're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. You know, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim.
Okay, and y'all can hear me now? Fine, okay. So that was funny because I actually couldn't hear the clip, but I've watched the clip enough times, so I know it. I don't know what my audio is doing, but so if we go by Butler's interview, right, gender isn't just putting on a dress one day, and it's not even just about getting on stage that one time. Instead, it's about all these different forces that are pushing and pulling against what we think about other people and about ourselves. One of the strongest forces we deal with when presenting our genders is the government. And Clone mentioned some of the different forces, but for now I want to focus on that one. For centuries, different empires and nations have tried to dictate what gender looks like and what genders exist. So, for example, in the 1890s, US soldiers were instructed to incarcerate two-spirit bidets, a group of people on the Crow Reservation who did not present as male or female. Soldiers arrested bidets, cut off their hair, and made them wear men's clothing. Or in the case of hijras in India, another non-male and non-female group. In the late 19th century, the British administration created a police registry specifically for the quote-unquote destruction of hijras. They were stripped of their clothing, their property, their possessions, and forced to present as either male or female. And all of this may seem like a long time ago, but the fight is ongoing. European and US forces have constantly insisted that there are only two genders, male and female. But this is really unique and specific to Western Europe and US colonial contexts. In so many different countries, we see activists of all kinds of different genders fighting for their rights and fighting to ensure that they are not destroyed and not erased. Black travestis and quilombos in Brazil, Bakla and Bavelan and trans women in the Philippines, these are all examples of genders and gender activists that do not fit within a white Western conception of a male-female binary, fighting today for the right to live. So much of the way we understand gender here in the US is bound up in white supremacy and about trying to impose a rigid system of gender that doesn't work and doesn't apply to so many people. But because colonial governments have sought to enforce this system so violently over such a long period of time, it can feel like it's inescapable or something that many of us find ourselves fighting for in the everyday. So some of y'all may have heard about this already, but yes, well, over the past year, over 100 anti-trans bills have been introduced in the US. And yesterday, Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Attorney General Ken Paxton announced that affirming a trans young person's identity should be considered, quote unquote, child abuse. Governor Abbott specifically instructed the Department of Family and Protective Services in Texas to launch investigations against any parents that affirm their trans children. For those of us who have been hearing about all the bills in Arizona, Florida, Tennessee, which is where I'm from, and everywhere else, this feels like more of the same. But the moves here in Texas are a really serious escalation. What they're threatening to do is to separate trans youth from their families if they try to seek treatment for gender dysphoria. It also creates a witch hunt where all school administrators, teachers, doctors, and therapists are instructed to report anyone they think might be trans or trying to transition. So I know I mentioned some of the colonial origins of the gender binary, but there are two specific kind of trends that the Texas government is relying on that I want us to keep in mind before we continue thinking about activists who are working against them. The first is that they're focusing on children, which is very purposeful. And the second is that they're framing the issue around child abuse. Texas is focusing on children because they know that young people under the age of 18 have so few rights and that it's difficult for youth to advocate for themselves and organize. The US state has often targeted children to break up undesired communities. They did this with Two-Spirit children in indigenous communities by sending them to boarding schools like the one pictured here. Oh, I skipped on, sorry. At the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. They've done this with African-American families through agencies like Child Welfare and Protective Services. And they've done this with Korean adoptees kidnapped and brought to the United States after the Korean War. Children have often been a medium that the state uses to control racialized populations. The same is going on here. Texas is trying to separate trans children from their families and regulate what gender should look like and feel like. Fortunately, there are some things we can do in this fight. And I'm happy to share more of these resources at the end of the presentation or during the panel. But I thought I'd also share a couple of examples of queer and trans people that lived their lives despite all of this state regulation and state intervention. People like, oh yeah, those are some of the organizations that I can talk about later, but people like Polly Murray, a longtime lawyer and activist famous for their work with the NAACP and National Organization for Women. Murray's been credited with writing the quote unquote Bible of the civil rights movement, and they were constantly cited by Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a pioneer in women's rights. But what's maybe less talked about is that Polly Murray privately changed their pronouns multiple times in correspondence with friends. They talked about being referred to as a man and a woman, and they mentioned thoughts about changing gender, though it looked really different for them than it did for some of the more public trans people at the time. Or Val, a white trans person in the 1950s, who told her parents that she identified as a girl early in life, despite being assigned male. She and her parents negotiated resources like hormones and surgery together and arranged to be treated as a girl in school with school administrators. In every single decade of the 20th century, we have examples of trans people and trans kids that build a life around the narration of gender, around all the different scripts that Judith Butler is talking about, around some of the scripts that Clone is talking about, and negotiating them, playing with them, and arranging them into a life narration. Lots of these examples of people are thinking about, not just thinking about what they wear or how they perform, but how people treat them and how they find recognition from teachers, parents, lovers, and yes, even institutions. So even though the events in Texas are really angering and depressing, I want to remind everyone that trans kids and trans people have always organized against the state and will do it again. And we can think of people like Polly Murray or Val who give us hope about trans life and trans joy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eva. We'll turn to the panelists, and y'all can go in any order. I'm not sure if there's a set order, but who, fight it out. Who wants to go first?
Oh,
I can go.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sam Seymour. I'm a PhD student in the English department at Penn. I'm in my third year. I use they, them pronouns. I'm non-binary, genderqueer, transgender. Those are all, I think, words that apply to me. Basically, what I wanted to talk about today was just like my personal experience accessing trans healthcare at Penn as a Penn student, especially at Student Health Services. So I've been getting trans healthcare from Student Health Services for about 2 years now. I'm prescribed feminizing hormone therapy from my provider at Student Health Services. So I'm on estrogen. I give myself an estrogen injection once a week. And then I also just in October got breast implant surgery at Penn Medicine, and that procedure was covered by my Penn student insurance plan. So that's kind of those are the experiences that I'm drawing from, and happy to talk more about either of them when we have a chance, when there's a chance for you to ask some questions, if there's something I don't cover now. And yeah, I guess just in case it's not clear, like when I talk about, I'm gonna talk a lot about hormone therapy or hormones. And so I'm specifically talking about gender affirming hormone therapy when I say that. Basically like taking sex hormones that your body doesn't produce itself in order to change your gender. And yeah, I just hope that my personal experiences are helpful for you in some way. And if you're a student at Penn, like I am, I also just kind of hope that I want you to know like that there are a lot of really cool resources available to you, and maybe give you a sense of what it could be like to access some of those resources. Acknowledging that like everyone is going to have a kind of different experience, but yeah, I'll just share what it's been like for me. So I started taking estrogen 2 years ago. I had been struggling consciously with gender dysphoria for a couple of years and identifying as non-binary for like a few months when I started. And I had like thought about taking hormones before, but I wasn't sure if it was right for me. It was an idea that kind of scared me. And I think I felt like I didn't feel that I was definitely a woman at that time. And I think I kind of had this association like gender affirming hormone therapy is only for like quote unquote binary trans people. And I didn't think that was me. So I thought like, even though I was kind of intrigued by hormones, I thought that maybe it wasn't quite, it wasn't for me. And like, it was kind of a scary idea for me. And I think that I also kind of had absorbed this idea that like taking hormones is this kind of like huge earth-shattering decision. Like you should only do it if you're absolutely sure that it's what you want, because you know could be some scary side effects. And I think that perception kind of scared me away from kind of learning more about what hormone therapy looks like. But eventually I became so unhappy with like the gendered part of my life that I reached a point where I was just like, I need to do something more proactive to like be who I want to be or become who I wanted to be. So I thought like I knew that I knew that I could get hormones prescribed through student health services. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna make an appointment, get some info, and maybe that will help me figure out if this is right for me. So when I got to my appointment, and which it's very easy to do, you just like log on to your student health services portal. There's like a special kind of appointment that's trans healthcare. There's like a whole team at Student Health Services who work on this. So I got to my appointment with Julia, who's the person I saw, and I realized very quickly, like when Julia kind of said to me, okay, like if you want hormones, I can prescribe them to you. This is what it would look like. Just like having someone say that to me, like, you know, this is an option that's available to you. You can do it. It's not this kind of like crazy thing to do. It's a normal thing to do that might help you feel better. I immediately was like, oh, yes, of course I want to try this. Like, I can't believe it took me this long to kind of get in this space where like this was going to be made available to me. And Pennsylvania is what's called an informed consent state. So it means that in order to get prescribed gender affirming hormones in Pennsylvania, you don't have to like prove you're trans. You don't have to come with a letter from a therapist or anything. Basically, the provider is just required to give you info about what the hormones will do. And then, if you want them, you can get prescribed them. So yeah, like I said, I think, you know, my experience at Student Health Services was that like while hormone therapy wasn't taken lightly by my provider, it was just presented to me as like a kind of, you know, a decision that might help me reach my goals. That would be like a reasonable decision that I could start whenever I wanted. And that really changed the way I thought about things. And like, you know, when I talked to people in my family about it, I had a lot of people saying like, well, why don't you wait? Like, maybe you should see if you're more sure, you know, wait another year and see if you still feel this way. And, you know, I think in the end that perspective would have been really, that perspective was damaging for me because I had waited long enough. And, you know, in the end, like there's no, I think it's unlikely that you're ever going to be 100% sure about any decision, but yeah, I guess I just want to emphasize kind of how important it was for me to be in that space where hormone therapy was just presented to me as something I could do in a kind of undramatic way. And in the past 2 years, it's made me feel a lot more like myself. So yeah, like I said, I've also received gender affirming surgery at Penn, which is certainly a much more complicated process than getting hormones, but also, you know, certainly possible. And I'm happy to talk more about kind of what that looked like. But basically, the main message that I wanted to get across today is just that, like, if you're curious about gender affirming hormone therapy, if it's something you've thought about or you've been interested in for yourself, I'd really encourage you to make an appointment at Student Health Services, because it's like easy to do. You'll get some really helpful info. No one's going to try and pressure you into doing something you don't want to do. And you know, I also want to emphasize that like there are a lot of different ways to do gender affirming hormone therapy. So you can try it out and then change your mind if it doesn't feel good. You could start on a low dose to kind of like see how that goes if you want some of the changes to happen more slowly. And my experience has been that Julia has really helped me. Like, the care was very much oriented around what I wanted, and she just wanted to help me kind of achieve my goals and feel more like myself. So I was really kind of put in the driver's seat of like using hormones in the way that was good for me. And the last thing I want to emphasize is just that, you know, I don't really love the term binary trans. I'm not sure that it really applies to anyone. But I guess I just want to emphasize that you don't have to be binary trans to take hormones, or for hormones to be something that might be helpful for you. So like I said, I'm non-binary, and I feel like being on hormone therapy has made me more androgynous, more ambiguous, more able to kind of embody different genders depending on how I feel on a given day. And those things are all really important to me. So I probably sound a little bit like an evangelist for gender affirming hormone therapy. And I know that it's like not for everyone, and we're not like a cure all, but I did just kind of, I guess I wanted to talk about how it's been important to me and how grateful I am. How grateful I am that I have access to it at Penn.
Thank you, Sam. I'm also going to second everything Sam says. I've also used trans healthcare at Penn. Shout out to Sigrid Larson there. But I also shared like a PDF of different resources that I just put together from like the LGBT Center, but also SHS on like different web pages to go to get started with different things. Once again, no, yeah, Sigrid is great. So once again, like ask anyone any questions, and even if you're just like interested, just like go in and like talk with people. That is seconding, thirding everything Sam said. So Justin, Malik.
I'll jump in here. Thank you so much, Favor. And let me just say first and foremost, I am so honored to be in this space today. Thank you, Clone. Thank you, Ava. Thank you, Sam, for sharing your wisdom. I'm in awe. Like, I was taking notes. I was really leaning into so much of what you all were sharing. And Sam, thank you for sharing your experience in terms of navigating resources here at Penn. It's really exciting to know that Penn is a trans affirming space and a gender non-conforming affirming space, although at times it does not seem that way. There are lots of behind the scenes things happening and resources that are available. So again, my name is Malik Muhammad. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I serve as the Associate Director for the Penn LGBT Center. I do want to apologize if you hear any outside noise. I'm in a space where there's some other folks doing some work, but I hope I'm coming through clearly. For my piece here, I really want to name that I am here as a cisgender man. I identify as bisexual, and I think that is such a powerful thing to just name in this space, is that we have a collection of folks across gender identities, right? That is allowing us to understand that gender is fluid and it looks different for everyone, and everybody has a place to share when it comes to how we engage with gender. I want to bring forward that so much of how we engage in our everyday world is about managing expectations. The expectations we have of ourselves and expectations we have of others. And that full-heartedly comes into play when we think about how we engage with gender, how we engage with sex, how we engage with sexuality, and the nuances that comes along with that. Clone and Ava really put into context the wide range in which we really engage with gender and sexuality and sex. And I just wanted to drive home this notion that so much of that is brought forward by the expectations we put on ourselves and on each other in terms of how we're supposed to express our gender. I want to quote Alok Vaid Menon, who is a gender nonconforming writer, an activist, who talks about the essence of understanding gender fluidity from a lack of self-love. So often people engage and are confused or upset when they see things that step outside of the quote unquote norm, because they're living in their own fear. Their fear of freedom of expression, of being able to come forward and be who you are without having to meet so many of those expectations that are constantly thralled upon us. I loved, Clone, when you brought in this idea around friction and fiction and how we are navigating these gender expressions and dynamics from a place of arbitrariness that is not always necessary. But we have to acknowledge that that is the world that we are living in. And how do we navigate that? By opening up our minds to expand our understanding of the quote unquote gender binary that does not need to be rooted in such a dichotomy, right? How do we embrace the diversity of gender and even think about the biodiversity of us as humans? Too often we have been trying to limit the human experience to this or that category without fully getting a true capture of who we are as a people. I'm so blessed to be living in the time that we are in today, where we are actually acknowledging so much of that nonconformity that, as Eva pointed out, has been around for centuries. I get so frustrated when people go, what's this new pronoun thing? Or what's this new gender nonconforming thing? I'm like, wait a second. Y'all have not been able to look into the history of understanding that gender nonconforming people have been around since people have been around. And too often we are pushing forward these very Eurocentric narratives of how we're supposed to engage in our everyday life. I also loved how Eva brought forward Judith Butler, who is such a force in how we engage with gender. But I love that notion of performative gender, or gender that is performative versus performing gender, right? Even as a performer myself, right? I'm an actor, singer, dancer. And it's so interesting to me when people talk about how art imitates life. So much of that is true, even when we think about how we express our gender. We are constantly stepping into our everyday lives, doing a performance. It doesn't matter who you are, how you identify, we are all performing on a daily basis. I'm not saying that we're acting or that we're putting on a show, but we are in a space of performing. So how do we come to understanding that I have a choice in how I want to perform, how I engage in the world on a day-to-day basis? Too often, we are being squashed. That extreme sense of erasure that we see in terms of how we engage with fluidity. And not to mention bringing forward that piece around intersectionality and how the multiple layers of our identity are going to impact how we even engage with our gender, right? It's so damaging, the rhetoric that folks spew around how we're supposed to engage with gender, because they are stuck from a place of fear. They are stuck in a place of not being willing to even find that self-love, right? Eva started to talk about some of the anti-trans bills that we're seeing across the nation. And it reminds me that so often we hear folks talk about, it's 2022, you can be whoever you want, do what you please. Are y'all blind? Right? That sense of that freedom that we are supposedly seeing. Yes, there has been some strides in how we have pushed forward for the queer community in general, but there are so many folks who are trying to push us back decades, right? So we have to be willing to really acknowledge that there is still so much work to be done, which is why I want to just again say kudos to you all as students, and for the advocacy that y'all are bringing forward, for the opportunity of educating folks, right? It should not be your responsibility to have to come into these spaces and do this work, but I applaud you for doing so, because taking that step of bringing your own authenticity is enough to sharing with the world about what it really means to be gender diverse, to be gender nonconforming, and to embrace that essence that gender can look and manifest itself in so many ways. I will simply say the LGBT Center is certainly a space that folks can come, learn, get engaged, find that sense of community. There are a few student organizations that you may want to get involved in, namely Penn Non-Cis. I'll leave my piece at that, but I just want to say again, thank you so much to our amazing students for putting this together and for providing me a space to just share a little bit about my thoughts around gender and how we engage. Thank you.
Okay, Justin, you know what time it is.
Thank you, Favor. And thank you. I I feel like a bobblehead. I'm very much a visual, like a affirmative nodder. When I hear things I like, been nodding on and like nonstop this entire time. So just want to say I'm so thankful, like Malik said, to be in this space with y'all and be like, I might be on this panel, but I want to affirm, like, I'm learning, like I'm here learning with you, from you. Everything that's been said today, like all the pieces, Clone, Eva, Sam, Malik, like I've been blown away by like all this knowledge that is being shared today. So just so thankful for you all being a part of this and for joining me in favor and like setting this up and everything. I'm so excited. This is amazing. And just kind of my piece, I really wanted to focus on talking about different things people have said already, but also synthesizing that into how can we take this into our own lives, which is people have brought in with their own respective sections, but talking about like, what does it mean to be in this space and to take it into your own setting, your own lives, your own daily operations, and also how to think more expansively about the way gender works as a thing. Because I feel like a lot of the times, at least I want to preface that all of this comes from my own personal experience. And I don't want to talk as if my experience is the only one that is like valid, as something that is right. Definitely, especially during the Q&A section, if you feel the need to push back, feel that like I want to allow that space and that ability. I want this to be a conversation once it hits the Q&A part. But this is coming from my own kind of experience and understanding, like the way we talk about gender, like a lot of the ways people will come into contact and understanding with gender is in sometimes the academic space. People will be like, I'll come to college and learn more. I'll take this class, I'll learn more. And I think academia does a good job of giving people that experience and that understanding, but sometimes it's so far removed from the lived experiences of individual people that people walk out and they're like, okay, cool, I know all these things, but like, what are you doing with it? So I just wanted to call attention to that and just talk about like what does it look like to take this kind of knowledge and like apply it in your own life? Because I think taking from example, the ideas around intersectionality that we've kind of been discussing today, it's like gender is not something that exists on its own. It's something that exists, breeds, evolves as we kind of, as have been talked about, perform, as you live through your life. It comes from that aspect of personhood, and your personhood, there's 7 billion people on this planet. Insane to me, but it's a huge number. But the idea that is often perpetuated, like this idea of a binary, and that even within, when we expand gender to be about more than just a gender binary, the idea that people will experience certain things the same way is a farce. Because when you think about even cisgenderhood, a definition of masculinity, of manhood for one person is not going to be the same as another person who identifies as a man. It's not going to be the same as maybe a trans masculine person either, or a non-binary masculine person. And so taking that into account, and also taking into account other aspects of diversity, race, socioeconomic status can affect gender, your sexual orientation can affect gender, your experience as a human being can affect gender. And I think so often we forget about how gender exists not only as a thing, but as a thing that relates to all other things. For example, I'm going to use myself as an example for a lot of these discussions, but me as a person, people will look at me and have a very specific idea about my gender and about how they expect me to act before I even talk. As Clone was talking about, the way that voice is a aspect of gender, and voice presents itself as people perceive something from your voice immediately. looking at me, if I were to, even with my hat on, if I were to take off my hat, I have a do-rag on, there's certain, and taking into account my dark skin as well, my presentation has certain implications for my gender. As a dark-skinned Black masculine person, that has a very particular masculinizing effect, so that people will look at me and automatically make that assumption, oh, I expect a deep voice, I expect a certain way of talking, I expect a certain, et cetera, that factor into my gender. And when I defy that, with my little cloud earrings, my little gold glasses, people are surprised. And that's interesting to me because so often we think about race and gender as two separate things that run on their own parallel courses. But for people who experience race and gender, or have a race oppressed and a gender oppressed identity, it's one and the same. It can never be separated. My race, my Blackness is never separate from my non-binary identity, which is not separated from my queerness. I will always be looked at some type of way because I present masculinely, because of my dark skin. And I will always be assumed to, and that translates into like a queer space where there's certain expectations around gender in the space of like gay men, for example. And I'm expected to perform a certain way in that space, based on my own, not even my own, the way people perceive me. That all to be an example of, I think we learn about these things and translating that into the way we analyze these systems that work every day, and our own assumptions and biases around gender and about race and about socioeconomic status and how they factor into each other is really important into understanding gender, because I don't think you can understand them as individual things. They all commingle, co-affect each other, commingle is like the right word, but like they all intersect and act upon each other in ways that manifest in a personhood. Your personhood is not, I am Black, and on this other separate train, I am queer, and on this other separate train, I am non-binary. It's I am a Black, queer, non-binary person, and that shapes my experience as a human being within the society that we live in. And that is kind of you can't separate. It's like this big pot of like things. And I'm like, okay, let me try and get out just the queerness. The entire bucket's gonna fall over. There's no way you can separate even a little bit the individual things that make me a person. So I say, excuse my rambliness, because I feel like I ramble whenever I get super heated about things. But that is all to say that translating that into people's individual aspects of and understandings of gender, I think we have to stay very, very critical about what our perceptions are around gender. Do I look like a non-binary person to you? What does that mean to look like a non-binary person? What kind of conceptions are we putting on of what, for example, like I'm using the example of a non-binary person, but like, what does that mean? And how is that a product of institutionalized, racialized, capitalistic, patriarchal systems that we exist in throughout every day? What does it mean to be a woman? I'm going to keep using the example of Blackness just because that's the space I come from, but Black women are constantly masculinized. You see Megan Thee Stallion, Michelle Obama, people who have darker skin, who are perceived some type of way because to a certain group of people, womanhood, cisgender womanhood is white. And how do we grapple with that? How do we reject that on our day-to-day basis? Because those kinds of things are, and please excuse me for getting a little dreary about it, but that's what leads to certain instances of police brutality, because we're not seeing people in their personhood. We're seeing skin color, and we're seeing gender, and we're making assumptions about their personalities and their values and things like that based on just a quick 1-2 look. of a person that wouldn't happen for a person of a different gender. And so we need to be critical of that and understanding of, well, where are these things coming from? When I interact with another person, did I say something? I think that is very uncomfortable, but it's that uncomfortability that creates change. It's only through recognizing, oh, this is a random example, but I call all Black women dude, but I don't refer to that to white women. Where's that coming from? How do I change that? How do I recognize that and make that active change towards betterment? Because it's those little things, as much as it seems small, it has very dynamic and very large exacerbations that can lead to things down the road. So I think being constantly critical of your own biases and understanding of not only we're sitting in this space and learning about these things, but taking the time, like maybe it looks like 5 minutes after this call. What did Justin say? What did Ava say? What did Malik say? What did Clone say? What did Sam say that pertains to my life and pertains to my experience? And how do I take that with me after we log off of this little Zoom realm that is Understanding Gender virtual panel? How do I take that and analyze what I'm doing and how that is affecting my perceptions and the way I view gender, queerness, non-binary identity, racial identity? Because it's all mixed. It's all confounding and tough to understand, because a lot of times it doesn't make sense either. It doesn't make sense why darker skin would have to do with gender. It doesn't make sense like fundamentally, but it's just the system we live in. And so we need to grapple with that. And in order to create the change, we have to create the change within ourselves. And only from ourselves can we then work to create better institutions that we step into, because individuals create institutions. Institutions are made up of individual people. And so when you step into a room, your clubs, your Goldman Sachs internship, or the jobs you'll have in the future, how do you bring what you carry and then affect what's going on there? It all is confounding and affects each other, because it's only through individual biases that institutional biases then come out too. Though that's not mentioning even the systems that have been in place for thousands and thousands of years. Capitalism, patriarchy, misogyny, it's all intertwined together. And only through changes on the individual level and that magnify through the different higher aspects of it can we make larger change. Sorry for my little ramble, but that is from my experience the kind of idea around how we can take this and really apply it to what we do outside of this little Zoom room.
Thank you, Justin. So once again, another virtual applause, I guess, for our panelists and our two lecturers. But now it's Q&A time. So like you can like raise your hand and ask a question, or if you don't like to talk, you can also put like a question in the chat and I can read it out for you. But like anyone can ask anyone, or if you have any comments, just more ideas you'd like to hear about. Okay. Drew put in the chat, I teach history and want to hear your thoughts about balancing content and historical thinking skills. Happy to explain more here or via cam. Thank you. Do either of the lecturers want to take that question? This is historical in nature, low-key.
Drew, could we ask you to say more?
Yeah.
Yes, first, thank you for providing this opportunity to hear in the panel. I appreciate it very much. I teach locally in Philadelphia, outside Philadelphia, at a Quaker school, and teach semester electives to juniors and seniors on gender and sexual diversity in the US. I've done that 3 times, and I'm doing one now on global perspectives. And so for the US specifically, I'm always mindful of wanting to provide content because I know many of my students just don't know that content, and I don't know the ancestors, don't know the people, don't know the stories. And so I find myself less thinking about historical thinking skills and really just wanting to make sure they know people, they know their lives that have come before them. So I'm very grateful for organizations like One Archives providing lesson plans geared towards high school students. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts, especially if you're aware of history books that are geared to high school students, or maybe entry-level college, kind of that age group. That would be wonderful to share. So I'm always happy to add. Most of my Twitter feed is asking people about teaching high school students. And I get a lot of responses and also a lot of no responses. So hopefully that makes sense.
I can take a first stab at that question. Thanks for your comments. I appreciate the thought, and haven't looked at those lesson plans from the One Archive, so I'll check them out. But I feel like in my experience when working with younger students that I've done kind of similar things to you around focusing on case studies of like individual people and ancestors from a particular time period, but then doing a lot of historical groundwork and contextualization around saying, okay, yes, I'm sort of aligning this with a trans history and trans genealogy, but they never called themselves trans. And that's really important. And like, how might we think then about how Polly Murray talked about their gender? And, you know, I made the choice to use they, them. That is a choice. They didn't use they, them. And then talking about how people around them perceive them, and the switch in genders between she and he, depending on what decade it was and what context it was, and really just like blossoming out from that individual person, partially because I find the stories really moving and really compelling, and they help me feel a bit more connected to earlier generations, instead of just thinking trans kids suddenly exist now, and that's not true, and they've existed for a long time. And that's been like a pretty, that's worked for me more than, you know, some of the just kind of large scale, like, here's the history of trans regulation in the US, though I've done parts of that too. But yeah, I'd be curious to know, I guess, more about, you know, how that's worked for you with the individual people and thinking about trans ancestors and stuff, because that's how I've been thinking about it.
The historical thinking does happen because it's wonderful to ask those questions, and students are very mindful of being able to self-identify, and as historians looking back and trying to identify those who, and we do get into terms like social construction and essentialism, and I've been able to use the work of Jen Mannion and Susan Stryker, and students, they get that, how they look into archival material. You have to understanding the context, the language today versus language then, and how to look for people historically. And so they understand there always has been gender and sexual diversity. So it's also part of it is just accessing archives. It's just not, so I'm always looking for more online sources where students can access archives to do some of that work. But at the same time, that's painstaking and time consuming, and my students don't have grad students and others, undergrad students doing the work for them at different times, right? To working all together. So then I get stuck in wanting to keep moving forward to make sure I have content.
Yeah,
So-
there are two digital archives that I've worked with for teaching materials, and I'll send those both to you in the chat. One is US based and one is Argentinian based, but they have a ton of like content that you can like dig into. But also just want to say kudos, like if I had been able to learn about any of the things you're talking about as a high schooler, my life would be so different. So like, I'm so happy to hear that you're teaching all of these things. It's stuff I did not have access to when I was younger. So that's amazing.
I can read Michael's question. We'd love to hear more about what Penn as an institution and a culture does well and not so well regarding being an inclusive space for non-cis community members. Anyone can take this question. Yeah. And also the clone is putting some good sources in the chat.
Oh, I can maybe get us started just a little bit to say, I guess what we're trying to do in gender and sexuality studies, which is trying to help share gender affirming pedagogies and just best practices, which can be like very small things. Like if a student misgenders someone, that student might start freaking out and, feel some kind of way and turn it into a very large discussion. And sometimes the best thing is just to quickly apologize and move on with whatever you were saying. So those are kind of like the tiny little things that we're trying to collect resources for and think about some of the disciplines that think that they don't actually have to address issues around gender. Sometimes I think that folks think it's something, connected to the humanities or the social sciences, but really there's no discipline out there that isn't going to use some kind of example or case study where gender is going to be a factor. So I think, it's a very small and laborious type of project, but to kind of share some of those best practices to folks who think that maybe it doesn't actually apply to their teaching. So that's something small that I think that we're working toward. But I mean, obviously, I think those types of best teaching practices are something that need attention across the board.
I could maybe add a little bit here. I think that, I guess, almost everything I talked about were things that I think Penn is doing well in terms of kind of creating an inclusive space. And I also, just my own experience at Penn has been to be around a lot of really awesome trans people, which has been made life better. I guess I think there are, in terms of like things that I don't think Penn does well, certainly there in terms of stuff like the Penn student insurance plan, there's a lot of room for improvement. And myself and a few of my colleagues, including Eva, published an op-ed in the Daily Pennsylvanian with a kind of outlining, I think, what we think are some of the ways that the Penn student insurance plan is lacking. I also think that there are a lot of ways that Penn interacts with Philadelphia more broadly in ways that are harmful for all Philadelphians, including trans Philadelphians. So things like the kind of the unbelievable scope of the Penn Police Department to police West Philadelphia, kind of Penn's role as a gentrifier in Philly, the kind of refusal of Penn to commit to paying pilots on a consistent basis. These are all things that I think are harmful for trans people in Philly. So that's kind of, I guess, what your question makes me think about, Michael.
Also just share a few, especially from kind of the LGBT center perspective. While I agree, I think it's amazing to have trans inclusive healthcare services available for students and for faculty and staff. They're not always as easily accessible and not as easy to navigate always, although the service is there. I will say on the back end, there was lots of advocacy to even have that type of trans inclusive healthcare available in the first place, which I think was amazing to push forward, but there's always some room for growth there. There's also been lots of work around getting more gender inclusive restrooms around campus in a variety of different spaces, especially as we see newer construction being built. Gender inclusive restrooms are definitely being a part of the architecture that is going in. Some of the pushback at times for gender inclusive restrooms is like, oh, well, we don't have the space, or how can we convert this, or it's going to take a bunch of money. So now there is a plan for all new buildings to have gender inclusive restrooms readily available within them, while there's still some efforts to push more gender inclusive restrooms across some of the older buildings on campus as well. Of course, there's gender inclusive housing that is available, and that's not only for trans and non-binary folks, but for folks that are just looking to be in a more affirming space when it comes to their gender and or sexuality. It's certainly available. And then, of course, just having the LGBT Center space has been an amazing resource that is available for folks. Lots of student groups end up meeting there. As I mentioned, Penn Non-Cis is a group that meets regularly in our space now that we're reopening officially next week. So those are a few things, but I will say I'm not one to come in and speak and say that Penn is the best place for trans folks, although we do have a very high trans and non-binary population on campus. I believe the numbers are around 3% right now, which is amazing. There is always more work to be done, and I think there is some other efforts that are happening are around education. We do lots of educational workshops around embracing trans and non-binary folks. We've actually partnered with the Office of Affirmative Action to do educational workshop around transitioning in the workplace that has been really well received in a variety of spaces. We also do kind of just trans education 101s, 102s for student groups and things like that. I think one thing we are looking to do more of is provide someone who can be dedicated to transition related concerns here on campus, whether that be for faculty and staff or for students, right? So someone who might be able to kind of increase the pipeline to some of those resources that even Sam was talking about. Someone like a transition related coordinator. We're certainly looking into that. There have been some movements in getting more trans affirming care within counseling services, and some more queer folks in that space who are providing some groups that have been really useful, but there's still a push to get more trans and non-binary faculty and staff around campus. We're doing some work in those areas. But I would say generally it's an affirming space, but I will never ever say that Penn is not immune to the symptoms of heteronormativity and cisnormativity that we see in our culture, period. But there's lots of resources that are available. And if you, speaking to some of the students or other members of our Penn community that are on this call, if you want to push some stuff forward, you have advocacy ideas, please bring them to us. We can help push some of these things forward, because we know there is a level of hierarchy and bureaucracy that we see in our space that is hard to navigate sometimes. And we're always here to support and push things forward as best we can.
I just wanted to share one other thing. If you are not patient, if you do not want to wait for new buildings to have all gender restrooms, we made a sign, and I encourage you to print it off and put it over the sex segregated the segregated bathrooms. And we have copies here, so we can give you lots of copies. So if they happen to fall down, you can put them right back up. So if you don't want to wait, there it is, download.
Yes, love the quote of Philadelphia Fair Practice Ordinance. Yes, got to push that forward.
Anybody else have any questions? Thoughts, reactions?
Okay, I'm gonna call it a day, evening, afternoon, night, wherever anyone may be. Thank you all so much for coming to this event. Jess and I were really excited after so long planning it to get all these wonderful panelists and lecturers to speak for everyone. This has been wonderful. So everyone enjoy the rest of your day in whatever form you can, and have some gender thoughts, some confusion, anything is good. Yeah.
Thank you all for being
Favor,
here.
thanks, Justin, for organizing.
Of course. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. This has been wonderful, beautiful. So glad it happened.